We'll start by looking at how we can use the label tool in our programs. The purpose of the label tool is to display text on a form. Now, I don't want you to think that this is a text box. We'll talk about that later. A text box lets the user actually type in something in the box. The label here is an actual piece of text that appears initially when the form actually shows up. Although we'll see later on that we can actually use code to change the contents of the label, but it's the actual text that would appear in your form. Now, if we want to include labels in our forms, there are several ways we can go about doing this. One approach is that we can just simply double click on the label option in our toolbox. So as we saw, we can open up our toolbox and we can see a list of all the different tools available to us. We can just double click on it and then it will appear in our form and we can move it around and we can change the properties however we see fit. Another way is we can click on that option on the toolbox and drag it onto the form, and then that way it just appears initially wherever we let go of the mouse. A third option is we can just click on the label once, and then we can go to the form, and then we can just click again, and wherever we click on the form is where that label will appear. Now, I do want to mention that whenever we place the label on the form, we can move it around wherever we want. This is just to show that we have a couple of ways to add the label to the form, whatever you're comfortable with. As we mentioned, once we add the label to our form, we can move it anywhere we want. So we can just click on it and drag to wherever we want this label to appear on our form. And then once we've actually selected the label, we get a new properties window on the right side of Visual Studio. It's the same place where the properties window was before. The only difference now is we see the properties for the label and not the properties of the form. If you want to see the properties of the form again, you would just click on the form. But if you click on the label, you would actually see the properties specific to that particular label. And as you'll see, there are a ton of different properties for the label. So we'll at least mention some of the more common properties for labels. So we're going to have the name of the label, the actual text that would be displayed for the label, the location of where it is. We can include a back color, which if you take a look at the label, there's kind of like this dotted rectangle around it. We can actually put a background color behind that portion of the label. We can change the font of the label, so we can change what the text looks like. And we can even decide if this label is visible or not. So if it's visible, it would appear. If it's not visible, it wouldn't show up. And you might be wondering, why do we have a label where that can't be seen? Well, maybe we want it to appear in certain circumstances. For example, maybe if you click on a button, then you would set the visible to be true, which would mean that the label would appear after clicking a button. But there are a bunch of other properties, but these are some of the more common ones that we would be using for our labels. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the location property because there are some things about it we do need to take note. So if you look at that particular property in the properties window, you'll see that it contains two numbers that's separated by a comma. So it's similar to our size property that we talked about before for our forms, where we had the width and the height. The difference now is we're dealing with a specific location. Where does that label appear on our form? So in this case, the first number corresponds to the x-coordinate of the position. Now the x-coordinate means where between left and right is this particular label. The second number would be the y-coordinate of the location. So we're talking about up and down. Now, in order to figure out what that location actually means, we need to know where the origin is. And for all items, not just labels, the origin, which we denote as 0, 0, is the top leftmost corner. So if you take a look, and you can actually try this out yourself, if you click on your label and drag it all the way to the top leftmost corner, you would see that the location under the properties window would be 0, 0. Now, if you move that label to the right, that's going to increase the x-coordinate, and then if you move it down, it's going to increase the y-coordinate. I know this is a little different than what you're used to in geometry, where the origin is kind of like in the center, and if you move up, that increases the y-coordinate. If you move it down, that decreases the y-coordinate. But here, the origin is always at the top leftmost corner. Why it's set up that way, Honestly, I don't know why. I guess Microsoft decided to just do it that way. But that's what we would have to deal with whenever we're dealing with the origin. And I should mention that the actual location of the label is based on the top leftmost corner of the label itself. So you have to take a look at that top corner of that little rectangle, and wherever that is the location of the label. I also want to take a minute to talk about the name property for labels. So here, the name property just gives us the name of the label that's used in our code to identify the label. This works just like the name property for forms. So remember, with forms, by default, the name property says that the form is called form1. Well, for labels, by default, the name of our first label would be label 1, the second label would be label 2, the third one would be label 3, and so forth. So here we can think of the name property as this variable in programs. It works just like variables. It's actually probably closer to object names. It's probably the best way to describe it. So think of the label itself as a class, and each label that we create is an instance of the label class. So here, if we create a label, it's an object of that particular label, and initially it's called label 1. This is one of those cases where I do recommend that you change the name of it to something more meaningful. So like if the label is supposed to represent like the name of the person, maybe we want to change the name of the label to let you know which label you're talking about. Especially on a normal form, you're going to have several labels in there. And if you just have them label 1, label 2, all the way to like label 10, you're not going to be able to remember which label is which. So I'd recommend changing the name of the label right away before you actually use it in your code. Let's go ahead and do an example of adding a label to one of our forms in Visual Basic. So here we're in Visual Studio and we need to add a label. So remember, we'll go to our toolbox and we need to find label. So we'll scroll down here and we have label. This is what we want, not link label, but label. We'll double click it and we see it's over here. So we can change some properties with this. Now keep in mind, whenever we click on the label, we'll see the properties for the label. If we click on the form, we get the properties for the form. So make sure you click on the label in order to change its properties. So let's just see what we got here. So we don't need to change the color, the font. I think we want to change the name, the location, and the text. So the text is what appears on our form. So we're going to call this my label. So there we go. That changes the name here. Or at least what appears in our text. And then let's scroll down. I think we need to go to design. There's the name. We're going to change this to LB1. Now we don't see any changes here, but we will see the difference a little bit later on with our code. And then we'll scroll down here and let's change the location. Let's do something like 100 for X and 100 for Y. That's too far. Let's do 50-50. There we go. I like that. Okay, so with all that, let's go ahead and run our program. And we see here's our form, and there is our label. So sure enough, that does work. So we have added a label to our program. I should mention that we could drag our label to wherever we want. You might find that easier than putting in the actual coordinates for it. So now what we'll do is we'll go into our form, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually, I'm going to double click this to see if we can get, there we go. This is what we want. We want this sub procedure to appear. This is the, if you remember, the sub procedure that automatically executes when our form loads. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the text of our label in here. So the way we're going to do that is we'll use the name of the label. So we need to use LB1 since that's the name of our label. And notice that Visual Studio will actually give that to us. And then we'll do dot. And then we see there's all sorts of properties here. And we want to change the text option. So now we're going to change this to, we'll call it my, let's make it a string, my new label. So there we go. And then we're going to add a comment. And to do that, we use a single quote. And then we can type whatever we want. So we're going to say this changes the text for LB1. We'll save that. That looks pretty straightforward. So now, if we click on Start, we see that it's now my new label instead of, I think we had what, my label from before, if I remember correctly. Yeah, we had a my label, and here we can use code to change it.